Hello, everyone. I'm Ted, now recording under the YouTube channel of The Golden Echo. So this is, we'll see how much we end up discussing The Golden Echo or The Leaden Echo, because I've got my friend Cory with me here again, and we are going to, so I'll lay it out really briefly. Cory and I are both young fathers, and we both, how do you want to put this? We both live lives that we feel like brings us into contact with reality quite a bit. That would be how I'd put it. And so we've had a number of wonderful conversations, and we had a really lovely time talking about Pearlandra a couple of weeks ago by C.S. Lewis. And I said, Cory, I want to talk to you again. Do you have any thoughts? And we simultaneously wanted to follow up on a line in a different conversation that he'd had, which was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was something like, changing a diaper is one of the most theologically rich things that you can do. Is that pretty close?
I think it was philosophically rich, but it was something like that. I haven't listened. Philosophically rich. I haven't re-listened to that.
That's great.
It was a quote from Eric Pearl that Ken Lowry brought up with a conversation with DC's Schindler and John Vervaeke.
Okay, great. Thanks for that context. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
So we simultaneously, I think, thought, hey, we should talk about this. We should see why, let's say, that comment stirred things up for both of us. And so then you sent me an essay that you're just some thoughts, a couple of paragraphs of thoughts that you had regarding crying babies in airplanes. So Do you want to lead off with anything? I've got about 6 different ways I could take this, but I'm happy to have you in the steering wheel just as much as me on this.
No, yeah. The thing that's kind of been going through my head, as I listen to all of you brilliant guys who've read so much talk about this stuff on YouTube, and I want to talk about poetry at some point and get your, some insight for a poetry beginner, but it's occurred to me that so much of my experience that is valuable is stuff that's kind of like direct. Ken Lowry said it's like a contact epistemology, which I think is probably, close to describing it. But it also, you made me think of it in your conversation with Nate Heil when you were talking about the kind of knowledge that is expressed in poetry, or pointed to, maybe more accurately, by poetry. Mm-hmm. And also, which is the same kind of knowledge as knowing that mockingbird songs are related to blueberry season. Yeah. Now it's a very, very direct, very grounded, like it's kind of knowledge that you gain directly by interacting with something instantiated in reality, something that's not too far abstracted from our sensing of it. And that's very much related to how I think about I like hand-eye coordination stuff. I'm big into music, so I play piano and guitar from a young age, and I'm a pilot as well. And so just all of these things that involve doing stuff, there's a certain kind of thinking that's closer to participatory thinking, I guess, than abstracted propositional thinking. And then it's also related to having kids. And I would also argue that it's related to inconvenience in kind of a roundabout way. And it's Jonathan Pajot had his talk about the importance of disappointment and how disappointment is necessary and good. And I might even extend that a little bit to maybe that's part of the beauty of suffering as such as well, and that it points us to a specific way of interacting with reality and being able to perceive its beauty. So that's like super broad brushstrokes, everything that I think is connected here. Maybe we can spend some time connecting those dots.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You you drew the line from diapers to heaven. So, you've thrown it wide open. You've blown it wide open. I want to start out with, so I listened to your conversation with Ken Lowry, and he brought up, you're talking about contact epistemology. And he made some assertion like, it seems to me that Christianity is the religion of contact epistemology. And also tell me if the background, there's a lot of background noise right now. So if it's getting through, I'll just mute and wait for it to pass. Speaking of inconvenience. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. And he's using contact epistemology in an interesting way. So I did a little bit of digging, talked to Father Eric, tried to figure out what do we mean when we talk about contact epistemology. And as far as I can tell, like technically, contact epistemology is essentially saying that when you know something, you're actually coming in contact with reality, as against, say, your knowledge corresponding to or being an image of or not, say something like solipsism, where there's actually no connection. So it's funny that you brought up poetry and contact epistemology, because I think what Ken Lowry is doing there is actually he's generating a new philosophical concept through a poetic interpretation, misinterpretation, you might say, if you're not being charitable, but I would say charitably interpretation of the phrase contact epistemology. Because what he's saying is not so much, is my knowledge real? Because I think he thinks that. And that's what contact epistemology is about. But he's saying, actually, the way to get to that real knowledge also involves something like contact. So it's both. And he's going from, yes, my knowledge is real and I'm really coming in contact with reality, which is, I mean, that's certainly the Christian position. And so if that's what we're talking about, then I would say, yes, I definitely agree with him that Christianity holds to contact epistemology. He's saying this other thing, though, which is, I think, more or less what you and I are going to try to talk about. And so the way that I think about all of this is, okay, so you're in a dark room, right? And you want to know what's in the room. You find out what's in the room by running into stuff. That's how you, or by feeling it, right? So there's some of that stuff you might know where it is, and you already know where it is, right? So you can map it out. But everything else that's not in that room, the two ways you're going to find it is you're going to reach out with your hand and you're going to touch it. You're going to make contact with it. I think Ken's talking about something like that. Or you're going to run into it, and then you find out, hey, there's a table there, or a chair there, or some Legos, or whatever, right? So there's these sort of like two ways of coming into contact, as Ken's talking about there, with reality. One of them is that sort of groping with your hands and finding these things. The other one is when something goes wrong, right? Because that's what we mean when we're saying, like, when we're like groping around the dark room, is all of a sudden you bang your shin into something and it's like, oh, I didn't know, I need to like, I need to update my map, right? It's like, because I smashed my toe. And so you can, I think you can, at least to start, you can take that idea of, we're groping around in this dark room to, let's say, we're trying to figure out how to act in the world. And when we say act in the world, I think we mean something like, what potential should we actualize? And that's not a visible space, because, I mean, because its potential is something that you can't see clearly. It can go in all sorts of ways. And so you're like, all right, well, I think, I think this is a way to go. I think there's a trail here, whatever. And you start going down it. It reminds me of this great, I grew up with the Childcraft books, and they had this, I don't know, do you know what those, did you have those growing up, Cory? They're like kids encyclopedias. Okay. So they're like encyclopedias for kids. And one of them was on like plants, and they had this great, it was like, if you've ever tried to do tree identification, where you're like, they ask you questions, is it a conifer or a broadleaf? And you're like, oh, it's got needles, and you go over here. And so it's this like branching tree, if you will. It's fun to identify trees with trees. But you go through this tree identification. And so what they were is these huge, they're flow charts of tree identification. They're these I remember them, they're brilliantly colored double page illustrations where you're trying to identify this tree that's been given to you. But the thing is, if you make the wrong choice, then there's like monsters waiting for you. It's like giant spiders and crocodiles and stuff living in tar pits and things. So it's a real part of the reason it's stuck in my head is because of how incongruent it is. It's like, we're doing tree identification, and it becomes a matter of like, am I going to be eaten by giant spiders or not? It's like, maybe you should learn how to identify oak trees. I don't know. Maybe that's what it was saying. But
there's probably something symbolic there.
Yeah, you start walking down these roads, and right, so you can see. Look, we're gonna kind of get there, because and I'd like to maybe pick apart how pain and inconvenience, how we can maybe bring in some subtlety in the difference between pain and inconvenience. But when you're walking through life and then something hurts you, there's kind of two basic responses to it. One is, I don't deserve this, or this is discipline, right? Those are sort of your two, and you don't even need it. You don't even need to go the like Hebrews route where it's like there's a personal God who's disciplining you. You're just saying, I found something out that I didn't know was there. It's a pain point, right? You're talking about, hand stuff. It's like, how do you, when you're wrestling with your older brother or you're doing martial arts or something, the way that you find out just how strong you are, and the way that you find out how much your limbs can move and all this stuff, is you find it out when it starts hurting. which is like what pain is for biologically. It's like, don't touch that, it'll kill you. I think, did you and I talk about this the last time we talked about people who don't have pain like who don't process pain in their body?
I don't remember if we talked about that.
Okay, so you would think, oh, that sounds great. You can't get hurt, right? But these people it's really hard for them to stay alive, and they're just beat up, right? Because they're like, they'll break an arm and not know they broke an arm, and then it heals wrong, right? Or they'll like get these big cuts on them. Usually they're covered in scars and all this stuff, and you think, okay, maybe the pain's there for a reason, right? At least
because that's like something that we kind of understand because we've thought about things like that, and you're biologists, and we know medically that people have these issues. But when you hear, if somebody who's never thought about this before just hears, oh, there's a condition where you don't feel pain, like your initial reaction might be like, oh, that sounds great, sign me up. Like, but it takes a moment of reflection to be like, wait a minute, or looking at the case studies with people who suffer from this sort of thing, to realize how much that screws up your ability to live in reality, right? Yes. Because there's a kind of learning that's associated with pain, right?
Yes. Well, right. It'll teach you really fast, right? This is why say you spank a child, right? Because, and I tell this to my kids. I'm like, look, I'm not mad at you. My oldest, who's like old enough to understand this a little bit. I tell her, I'm like, I'm not doing this because I'm mad at you. I'm trying to let your body help you know how to do the right thing, right? Because if you think about it, it's like, that's my goal. My goal is I'm not trying to like get anything out or even really punish her for something that she's doing wrong. That's not really the point. The point that I'm trying to build up is, if you act that way, it'll hurt. And so the next time she goes to do that, she's like, I don't know if I want to do that, because she's 5 years old. She's not even 5 yet. She's not at the age of reason. She's not making reasoned moral decisions. But I'm trying to, but the things that she does still build up habits in her. So I'm very concerned with good habits in my children. I'm not concerned with them like choosing the wrong thing morally, because they're not doing that yet. And so
there's a question inherent in that, right? So we have the assumption in our modern society that you learn things by hearing information or by integrating information that you get from a book or from a lecture or YouTube video or something like that, right? So that is a way. That is a way of learning, right? That's up at the propositional level. So this way that you're describing of teaching your kids, which, if they're that young, like you said, they haven't reached the age of reason yet, and so they haven't developed the ability to skillfully abstract information to the degree that they can compare patterns at those high levels and then make decisions based off of, oh, this is like this, therefore I'll behave this way, versus a more direct experience, which is something a little more participatory, which is something that you're kind of like, I don't know if this is, I think that it's true that you can learn that way even prior to the point that you're born. Like fetuses actually learn because they have learned responses. This is a scientifically known thing. That's just kind of like inherent in, I don't know if you want to say consciousness or something like that. And it's a more direct way of learning. And it also seems to be maybe, I don't know, if we don't stop knowing how to learn in that way as adults either, right? We gain the ability to abstract, but there's something that's maybe, I don't know, how would you characterize your experience of that type of learning as an adult? Because there seems to be something more primordial about it, something that's, if you're trying to learn something, maybe even something more effective about it, if you're trying to build a habit, for example.
Yeah. So I think this is moving towards the meat of what we really want to talk about. And there's some real, So I'll start with, there's two examples I can think of right off the top of my head. And the first thing that I'd say is like, that it requires, I've been thinking a lot about, Augustine says that humility is the gateway to all the other virtues, which like, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and my understanding of humility is it's not about self-denigration. It's about being clear-sighted. It's about seeing things as they are, which necessarily will humiliate you, as we use the term, because we all in one form or another, and I could go into a lot more detail about this, and people kick up their heels about it. We all struggle with pride. Pride, not in the sense of, again, not in the sense of thinking ourselves great, but pride is where we orient things around ourselves rather than towards God, right? So that's the difference between pride and humility. Pride orients things around you. Humility orients things you towards God, which might actually mean you think much better of yourself than you did before. Hence why we have this idea of self-esteem. And it may make you think much worse of yourself. Hence why we have this idea of humiliation. In fact, I would say for every person, it will do both, depending on the area. Okay, what does humility have to do with inconvenience and learning? It's this. I need to have the humility to realize that I'm not nearly as much in the driver's seat of myself as I think I am. Right? I mean, the Catholic term for this is concupiscence, which just means I have disordered desires. Like, I want things that I can rationally understand that I should not want, or I shouldn't want them that way. And I find myself, because of original sin, I find myself in a state in which those disordered desires just override stuff all the time. I'm like, oh yeah, that's okay. That's a really bad idea. And I did it. Okay, hold that. Okay, I'm not this autonomous agent that I think that I am. I need some help. That's really what humility says here. I need some help. And this is part of why humility is the gateway to the virtues, because the virtues they're habituated dispositions towards the good. You build up a habit by doing something over and over. And if I'm concupiscent, I can't do good things over and over because I'm just going to do the garbage thing some of the time, most of the time. Okay, so then I start thinking about the two. I raised pigs for a long time. I actually started raising pigs before I had kids. And then we started having children. And I remember early on and I had no idea what I was doing. I'd raised some chickens before. That was my experience with livestock. And they're small pigs. It wasn't that big of a deal. But the first or second litter of pigs I had, they had something called the piglets had greasy pig disease. It's like this nasty bacterial infection on the skin that if they get through it, they'll have a resistance to it. And then later on, when the mothers have had it, they'll pass basically the immunological necessities onto their piglets. But the point was, I mixed all these, I'd gotten a few pigs together. They had these babies. The babies had this disease, and I had to go and give them penicillin shots, and you had to do it daily. And it's like, hey, it's late at night. It's unpleasant. Trying to catch piglets in a field is terrible. And it's like,
especially greasy piglets,
and when it's raining. And so I had this realization that it just doesn't matter what I want. Like, it doesn't matter that I don't want to do this. I just have to do this. I just have to do it. And then obviously the same thing is true with children on a much higher level, because
that changes your posture, right? Like, because you still have the option of sticking to the convenient route and not going out, even though it's cold and dark and raining and these pigs smell awful and working with needles and you just want to take a nap already.
Yeah.
But that there are going to be real consequences associated with not doing that.
Yeah, like a piglet dying. It's like this thing that didn't need to die is now dead because I just because I didn't do the thing, right?
Yeah. There's a way that, like, the consequences of your actions and what about the reality of choosing one route versus another kind of forces you into a particular posture towards that reality, right? And this is kind of like what Ken and I were getting at when you talk about things like combat or something like flying, where if you don't do what you're supposed to do and you're not disciplined, you will die, or worse, people you love will die. So that forces you into a certain posture of orientation towards reality itself. You cannot sit back and just assume that the way you conceive of things is correct. You have to do extra due diligence and develop discipline for yourself in order to create habits of behaving in that way, so that you're not blindsided when something comes up and you pay the price for it, right? It's the same sort of thing with raising kids as well, I would say.
Yeah. Would you consider inconvenience there to be... It's interesting because I feel like we're going back and forth between, on one hand, I could see inconvenience as my response to the necessary actions in the state, and an inconvenience also to be, let's say, the negative outcome of having not acted appropriately. Do you think that those seem like different things to me, though?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I was using it more in the former sense than in the latter.
Okay. Yeah, because it's interesting when I think about when I think about my will, right? There's this, and I remember, in my early 20s trying to figure all this stuff out about will, and it's an interesting thing because I remember being in this place where I thought I cannot see how my will operates, and yet I also simultaneously just completely believe in the necessity of actual human will. So isn't this funny? I mean, it's actually funny when I think about it. There's a very similar place to my scientific education, and it's just flat materialist notion of the world, and then my religious belief. And it wasn't so in both of those cases. I was in a place of tension that I couldn't resolve, but I didn't ever feel like I needed to like throw one of them out.
Right.
So, which is interesting. I don't know if that's just me or not. So it's
no. Actually, that's something that's actually really linked with. So, I kind of make sideways references to it, but I'm going to be honest. It makes me feel really insecure listening to you and Nate Heil and all these super brilliant, super well-educated people talking about this stuff, because I realize, like, man, I used to think that I knew things. I don't know anything at all. And my education that I do have is super technical and super specific and narrow. And yet, I know that that's not necessarily... There's still a connection there that needs to be taken seriously, because if you pay attention in the right way, even a very technical and narrow understanding, a deep but narrow venture into one specific thing can teach you as much in an absolute sense, maybe, as like getting a really broad understanding of many different things, depending on what your posture is towards it, right? And paying attention, seeing what the connections are. Like, it's a very unique and particular way of seeing the world, but it's incredibly valuable, especially when brought into contact, say, with somebody else's perspective, who, I have experience in certain things, and you have experience with farming and cooking and poetry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I mean, your point that it can is totally right, because you run into people all the time who have had that, and then there's nothing, and then they are unable to derive anything from this very technical and specific education that they've had. Whereas what you're saying is exactly true. If you have the capacity to look up or look over, or to you can talk about what word you want to use, but I'm going to use the word frame. If you have the ability to look over into someone else's frame, then all of a sudden all this stuff can start happening. And I think this is one of the things that Jordan Peterson got really right, that so many people were drawn to, was you don't sit around waiting to figure everything out. You just start doing something.
Right.
And like
exactly.
that. Yes. And then once you've started doing something, then that can transition into all kinds of other stuff. And
put as much effort as you possibly can into one specific thing and see what happens, right?
So
which is so kind of like what I've discovered that I've done accidentally, even though it's, if I could go back and do it again, I don't know if I'd choose the same thing, but I don't regret what I chose, because now I have a springboard.
That's exactly right. And so your ability to have that conversation that you had with Ken Lowry, and where you're seeing these connections between right, being in the military and being a doctor, right? It's that ability that now all of a sudden, because there's other guys that can go through military life and that's not, and that doesn't happen in them for whatever reason. And so the funny thing about like my life is that I think you could tell the story of my life in multiple ways. One of them is like generally the way that I do, because I see all the connections between these things, and I have, let's say, faith, right? That there is a coherence to this whole story, which I think this is a huge part of where we're going to get with Inconvenience.
Yep.
I have faith that there's actually a story there. And so I can tell, look, here's all these threads that run through my life of, say, ecology, philosophy, Christian and Catholic thinking, family, all of these things. You could also tell my story in a way that it feels like all I've done is just kind of like bum around and like given up on a bunch of stuff, and here I am. And so because the question is do I look at the things that I've done and say that was real? And like, if I take it seriously, if I take what happened to me seriously, or I really like Wolfgang's use of the word respect. If I have respect for what's happened to me, then I can see the connection between biology and butchering and earthworks and parenting and poetry and on and on and on. And it's like, there's, in that sense, I actually feel incredibly free because of that.
Yeah.
Because now I think, now I don't have to, in some sense, I don't have to worry where my life is going to go, because I know that wherever I'm going to end up, assuming that I act rightly and I don't say choose what's expedient, then that's not going to stop. Like, that's going to keep happening to me.
Yeah, it's the craziest thing ever since. Well, we don't need, but yeah, it's like you don't have to be worried about where you've come from either. It's kind of, it goes in both directions, right? Because you have faith that your life follows a kind of narrative. So if you have certain regrets about things that happened in your past, or decisions that you made, or things that have happened to you, whatever the case, you can, if you start to really pay attention, right? So that's one way of putting it that I've been using a lot since Jonathan Pajot has been, seeding my mind.
Colonizing your brain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You can start to see things in terms of a narrative, to where things that happened in your past, like this is one thing that I'm really, really glad about. Even though my religious education, so to speak, was fairly rudimentary, I still remember, and this actually had as much to do with the fiction that I was reading as it did the Christian worldview I was brought up in. I really, truly believed that everything happened for a reason. And that's a thing that's almost become trite, even within Christian circles, to where you're like, oh, you don't say that because that's a kind of a silly thing to say. But if you really, truly believe that from a young age, and you really, really are able to look at every single thing through that lens, it doesn't mean you're always going to be able to find a reason, certainly not find the reason, but that offers a certain posture towards everything that happens and everything that could possibly happen, so that you're always looking for that way to interpret things in a way that is most beneficial to you and to the world around you. And that's completely agnostic of how much suffering you do or do not experience.
So here's what's so interesting is that because it's trite until you start reading Ecclesiastes and Job, right? That's when it stops being trite. And so because there is I think there's a way that you can look at the world in which you can say, actually, by necessity, you're not going to understand all of it. It's not just that that it's hard to. It's like, no, actually, structurally speaking, you can't understand everything. So what do you do? And I've been trying to come up with this term. And this idea keeps coming up over and over and over. And it's great that you brought up fiction. I think you're going to enjoy the second half of my second conversation with Karen Wong, because we started talking about Daniel Toma, and then it just like, she brought something up about music and narrative, and I was like, okay, we're going to just follow that for the next 40 minutes, because this is really what I want to talk about. And this conversation I had with my sister, and I've been calling it something like natural faith rather than supernatural faith, where it's it is the capacity to believe that things cohere when you can't see them. When you can't see it. It's like, that's basically what Job is saying. Now, Job has had, let's say, such a catastrophe in his life, such a disappointment, that the only way that it can cohere is if he looks at God. There's no lower level that he can look at where it's going to make sense. But Pajot's point at the Chino conference of what's the in response to Vervaeke's question, what's the fundamental orientation that you should have when you have let's say, an indeterminate horizon of possible futures? And Pajot's response is, you look all the way up, because then it doesn't matter what happens to you. So
that's exactly the same thing as Peter looking at Christ as he's walking across the water. And then he stops paying attention to it, and that's when everything falls apart.
That's great.
This works out perfectly, because you have when you pay attention to a particular orienting principle, it actually gives structure to all the stuff that you're experiencing. So this is where the levels of learning kind of tie in a little bit, because as you get older, you can learn how to pay attention. This is a way of thinking about it, maybe. Correct me or stop me if this isn't making sense. I'm on the edge here. As you get older, you gain the ability maybe to pay attention to those higher order abstracted principles. And you continue to experience things the same way that you experience things as a kid. But because of your ability to pay attention to more condensed, more abstracted things, they give order to all of the experiences, all the sensory experiences that you are having. So they structure together in a particular way, kind of like if you drop a magnet in a pool of iron filings, right? How they all kind of like snap into patterns.
Yeah.
I think it's the same sort of thing. As you get older, and of course, you know.
Can you tell me what you mean by condensed abstracted things?
Yeah. So like, I guess the Neoplatonic idea that I really just learned about from reading Matthew Pajot's book about how you can think of the mountain, right? And as you go up, things are more abstract. If you think of a symbol, right? A symbol is an abstract concept that contains a bunch of things that have that form. Maybe is a, I don't know if that's the right usage of the word form. I think it is. So, but everything in reality can be described in that way. So the higher up in abstraction or in propositions is another way of thinking about it, that you go, you get more concepts that also come into a higher form that embodies or that contains all of them. And then even the higher form can link up with all these other forms that is contained by a yet higher form. And it keeps going and going until you reach the highest, most abstracted thing possible, which by that way of understanding things has to contain all of reality and has to be able to, it's still a principle, right? We kind of talked about this last time too, but it's you can understand that thing as the pattern that fills all of reality, maybe. And so when I say condensed or abstracted, I mean like
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, so it's interesting. Karen and I were talking about this notion of angelic intelligence as Dr. Daniel Toma presents it, following in the medieval Christian tradition. And what you're talking about is essentially, so we move up the mountain in that idea. You know, it's like the example is like dog. You know, these I see three things, and okay, there's something connecting them that they're all dogs. Okay, so then dog. You know, this is the Aristotelian notion of we see particulars and then our intellect abstracts forms. So I abstract the form of a dog from it, and that's making real contact with my intellect, and we can talk about that. That's why we're informed. The form gets in us.
Yep.
And then you can move up to say mammal, and then you can move up to say vertebrate. And I'm following a text. There's all kinds of ways that you could do this, but
there's a reason that all scientific forms follow taxonomical structures.
Yeah,
it's because
that's exactly right.
You can describe all of reality in that way.
That's exactly right. And so we're working from these particulars up, right? And so I would say, you asked me what a mammal is, and I'd say, oh, well, possums are mammals and kangaroos are mammals and cats are mammals and whales are mammals. And I throw in all the edge cases and weird things so that you understand how that's bounded. Well, the medieval notion of an angel is that the angel that was given the principle of mammal knew every possible mammal by having the principle of mammal. And so there's this weird thing where like the simpler, in that sense, the simpler the principle that the angel was given, the more powerful the angel was, because it can.
Yes.
So imagine that the angel of the principle of dogs, the angel of the principle of mammals, the angel of the principle of animals, the angel that's the principle of life, the angel that has the principle, right? And you can see
of being itself. That's not an angel anymore, but
there might be. I don't understand the angels, man, because we max out, and then you look at what's like Dionysius the Areopagite's talking about. There's like another 6 hierarchies of angels above that. You're like, okay, I don't know.
That's the thing that I need to. I haven't even started reading him. I've got his book or a collection of his writings.
Okay, so it's interesting that you brought that up in connection with old age, because this doesn't with growing older, and this is just you're just some insight you're generating for me, which is that. If we take this Aristotelian atomistic notion that we come to understand formal causes through particulars, the longer you live, you've been experienced more particulars, right? And so if you think about it, like as life goes on, you're moving more and more towards this, let's say, formal interaction with the world versus particular. Okay, think about when you're a young person and you're a young man, and say 12 or 14 or whatever it is, and you meet this girl and like, oh my goodness, this thing happens. What is that? It's like right here, and you don't even know what to do with it, honestly, because it just kind of takes you over. Like, okay, but then you're 45 and you've seen that play out 30 times or 100 times or 300 times. Maybe it played out with you 3 or 4 times, and then it went well or it didn't went well, and who knows. But you see how like it becomes easier and easier to pay attention to the form of the thing rather than the particulars.
Yeah.
So I think when you're talking about growing up and this sort of connection with the mountain, there's this, to me, that just seems to come straight out of experience if you're paying any attention to the world, because what it can do 2 things, Cory. One is it can afford you greater insight into those, let's say, simpler and more containing ideas.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that it could do is that could actually make you blind to particularity, which is the death. That's the death aspect of it. You stop being.
There's multiple aspects to that too, right? Because this is just one way of learning, and it can become self-deceptive. Mm-hmm. I think there's a couple of maybe ways that it can become self-deceptive. One way would be that the way that you're describing, where you kind of become blind to the particulars, and there's kind of a left-brainedness associated with that, a left-brain tyranny, right? Where you have your established structure, your way of understanding things, and that is the lens through which you are capable of perceiving the world. So, by definition, you perceive everything through that lens, and if it doesn't fit that lens, then you're not going to see it. Because you can't really see a thing unless you kind of understand what it is, right? For Paraland,
what is that? Right, Lewis. That's that Lewis quote.
From Out of the Silent Planet.
You can't see a thing unless you know it, because you cannot see a thing unless you know it. Yeah.
But the other issue is that everybody sees different particularities, and this is the part where your agency is only part of the equation, right? Because the particularities that you're exposed to in life, you don't have any say over that. You don't have any way of predicting any of that. You can hand 2 people the same giant stacks of books from the time they're children and have them exposed to exactly the same coursework and exactly the same. Try to make their experiences as identical as you possibly can, and they will still be 2 radical. Okay, to make it even better, 2 identical twins, right? So they're even genetically the same. But if they have you can't make their experiences exactly the same. And so they will be completely divergent individual people. And so you can also say there are connections you can make in the world by what you experience that are not, how do I want to say it? They're not false or incorrect because they happen. So there is a realness associated with it.
But they're not important.
Either not important, or they're not as all-encompassing as they're sometimes inclined to make us believe, right? Yeah. So say trauma is the example of this that I'm thinking of. You experience a terrible thing where something happens to you, or a set of experiences occurs at the same time that you now relate negatively to all those things that happened. And it could be something that somebody else experiences as a good thing. So is it a good thing or a bad thing if you experience this? The 2 people, if they don't have a way of thinking about it, could be inclined to think, like in an absolute sense, this experience is either all good or either all bad. And it's
well, and oh man, there's so much there. I mean, I remember consider hardship as the Lord's discipline. Because he disciplines his sons. It's like, by the hardship in your life, you'll know that you're a son of God. And so when we say, that was a bad thing that happened to me, it's like, well, I'm really involved in that. I'm really involved in the judgment and saying that this is bad or this is good. It's a very different thing when it happens to other people. But when it happens to myself, it's a very different thing. And your description of trauma. So then your description of trauma is, maybe I got this wrong, but it's like, it's the thing that because of its negative impact in your life and your inability to connect it to things, then you end up connecting everything to it. Is it something like that?
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. That's a particular type of trauma. Yeah. But because there's a type of trauma that, and Chad made a good video about how that's kind of a buzzword that's lost a lot of its intended meaning, right? So the word trauma, it's, all over the place, which is a good point. But if you think about it in terms of a thing that happens to you that is not only a negative emotional experience, but is also super salient in the sense that you can't ignore it.
Yes.
So the way that you put it is really good, I think, because you connect it to everything.
It's
in a sense,
salient.
it becomes a big part of the way that you perceive the world, right? It's kind of a central part of your worldview.
Okay, so I love this because it relates back to this notion of inconvenience that you are telling me about and that I love. Okay, so here's the problem. We're living our life, right? And then we've got things that we like, or they're just for whatever reason, like
Or even
food,
things that, even expectations, right? You can talk about in terms of expectations,
things going smoothly, whatever it is. And then we've got things that we label, this category that we label as inconvenient, right? As troublesome, bothersome, maybe bad, maybe
aberrations.
maybe
almost kind of by
maybe
definition the stuff you don't expect.
it's the stuff you don't expect, or it's the stuff that you do expect and don't want to have, right? It's like the dentist's appointment that you're not looking forward to. It's the examination.
Sure.
Okay, so what you're basically saying is there's an event that happened or is going to happen. There's a thing, right? And it has some particular, what's the word everyone uses? Valence. It has a particular valence. And I'm saying that based on the way that I talk about it. And you can imagine that, and this is really well-trodden stuff, okay? Like, you get an envelope in the mail, and then it's got your, it's addressed to you, and it's, say, from your great aunt. And there's like 6 different contexts in which that could be something that you would consider to be really terrible, and 6 contexts in which it could be something really wonderful, right? It's obvious that, and then 6 in which it's just nothing at all, like nothing even to pay attention to, right? Maybe she just sends you newspaper clippings all the time, right? And so you ignore it. Or it could be like, you've been waiting on news that your beloved great uncle is going to die, and you know what that letter means. Yeah. It's, or it's your great uncle who you can't stand, but who's also really rich and is going to leave you an enormous inheritance, and you know is going to die, right? It's like, you can see how this one letter. Okay,
yeah.
The point being, like, what you relate it to determines how you feel about this thing. Okay, so when we say inconvenience, we mean at least 2 things. One is something that gets in the way of me doing, say, like my higher order goals, like getting through my day, earning money, feeling comfortable, whatever those goals are, right? So that's one way we could talk about inconvenience. Another one is that it's just unpleasant, right? Like it's an unpleasant thing that I don't want. Now, in both cases, the way that we view that is actually the degree to, it's what we relate them to. So I'm a recent convert to Catholicism. One of the first things that I did, like 2 months after I entered the church, I was confirmed. I went on this 2-day walking pilgrimage, and it was amazing. And there's all sorts of reasons, like sort of things that were great about it. 1,500 Catholics with these like giant banners going through rural America, chanting, singing hymns to the Blessed Virgin Mary and praying rosaries. And it was like there was like Christendom in its glory laid out before my eyes on these dirt roads. But to me, the most profound thing was this, Cory. When I was there, it was in the fall. The first night was way colder than I expected it to be. And it was, what did I say? I was like, I could totally walk 18 miles, no trouble. And it was 23 miles. And so I thought I was going to be fine. As it turns out, I could walk 18 miles without any trouble. And the last 5 miles were terrible. I mean, they were so bad. But, it's like all of this stuff about how cool, like how cold I was that first night, the way that my legs hurt and on and on and on. And it's like, well, the whole point, the whole reason that I'm here is to be uncomfortable, right? Like that's the idea of a pilgrimage. It's a penitential act in which you're going out of your way to do this hard thing, this thing that like isn't nice in that sense. It's inconvenient. We're just going to go walk for 35 miles to do this. But when I was there, I had this attitude of, that's why I'm here. It's like, I don't have a sleeping pad because I never camp anymore. And so I'm like on the hard ground. Hey, you know what? That's why I'm here. Hey, my sleeping bag isn't warm enough. That's why I'm here. I didn't get enough sleep last night. That's why I'm here. I'm exhausted from the work I was doing this week. That's why it's like, and on and on and on. And so I got to see this. It's this thing where I think, well, man, if I could just live like that my whole life.
Yeah, right. If only
I could live like that my whole life, because I'm moving it towards something else. And
yeah.
And that's, and then what was great is, we had mass in the middle of the first day. We had adoration that night. And then the next day we had mass again. And we just had, it's like I was thinking at the end of that day, that really long day, I was like Christ is waiting for me at the end of this. And like, if I thought that like I could see him, in his divinity and in his humanity, like standing there at the end of the road, like it just wouldn't, I would have like,
you wouldn't even notice that you were suffering at that point.
Exactly. I would have noticed nothing. I would have noticed absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
It's like, you could be like, hey, Ted, someone cut your feet off. And it'd be like, oh, I didn't notice. I didn't notice. But because I can't see.
Here, hold that note for just a second.
Yeah. We're picking up because Cory was Inconvenience. Yeah, so what I'm trying to get at is something like the degree to which I could connect the uncomfortableness of what was going on with the purpose at the top of it was the degree to which it ceased to be viewed as an inconvenience. I wouldn't classify it as, I would still say that it's uncomfortable to the degree that it impinges on my awareness, but it stops being an inconvenience. Look, because then it affords me the possibility of being closer to God. That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah. So for example, just now, crying child, have to go take a pause for a second, very inconvenient, interrupt our conversation. But if I direct my attention to the fact that by comforting my daughter, by getting her to stop crying, I am filling her awareness, her entire way of seeing the world, as being a place where she's loved and comforted. And that's not, that is a principle that's part of the way up, but it's connected all the way up. So the best way to frame all of this stuff is to have the principle that encompasses the most, but also directs you towards the highest one possible, that explains everything possible. And if you identify what that thing is and you learn how to put your attention on that, then there's a way in which suffering doesn't even really look like suffering as much anymore. I don't know how to talk about that, because suffering is still suffering, and it's kind of silly. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's the ultimate end of a truly ascetic life, is that suffering becomes not suffering anymore, and you can genuinely take joy in trials and tribulations.
Well, I mean, the first end of ascetic life. So actually, and this is something, the first place I heard this was John Vervaeke, where he said that, and and I followed up on this, and this is great. So suffering is not fundamentally about pain. Suffering is about your agency being removed. So think about like the quote in the Lord.
That's what I mean by inconvenience. Yeah. Right.
Over the door in the Lord of the Rings, the way of the dead, right, where Aragorn goes and it says the living do not. Is it? No, it's the creepy old man that's beside the door in the books, and he says the dead do not suffer the living to pass. It's not like the dead; it causes the dead physical pain that the living should pass through, but it's like they will not have their will overridden here. They will not suffer it. They will not suffer that their will should be crossed. And so, right, because when this other experience that I had, which was when we had a sick child, and it was every 3 hours, I think, around the clock care for her for several months. And the thing that needed to happen took about 45 minutes to an hour every 3 hours around the clock. And so you get to this point where you're waking up at 3 a.m. and you're awake at 11 o'clock, and then you've got to be up for 40 minutes, and someone's going to have to be up again at 6. And it was that same thing with the piglets, but raised to a much higher level of, it just doesn't matter how I feel about this. It just has to get done. And at the time it felt terrible, but what I've found is that in my life, my capacity to resist my own sin, to resist particularly things like laziness and disorderly behavior on my part, that's still paying dividends over and over and over and over and over. And so when I look at that, I think, it was painful. Nothing made the pain go away, but was it an inconvenience? It's like, was it an inconvenience to have my soul refined? Right? It's like, if I can't see that as being good, what am I here for? Honestly, what am I here for if not that? And so it's that same thing again. It's like when I suffer something for the right reason, then literally, Cory, it's like if I suffer for good, my will to do evil is overridden. That's what it means. It's like my will to do what is wrong is overridden when I suffer for what's good. And what that means is that I am being forced into the habit of righteousness, right? Because by doing what's right, I'm building up these virtues, because they're habits. And so, man, this is great. I'm totally digging this. This is really cool. Yeah. When you suffer, it's like it's someone else's. When you suffer righteously, someone else is taking, or something else is taking over, and it's making you do what's right because your agency is removed in that moment. And you and I tried to pick apart some of that stuff in Paralandra the last time we talked about that whole thing where Lewis says Ransom has this moment where he's like, the choice, he realizes that he will have done the right thing. Like a time is going to come when he will have done the right thing. And he's like, I can't see the difference between choice and destiny. Right.
So there's the question there, right? Because your agency is removed in one sense because you have things coming at you and something's going to happen regardless of what you choose to do about it. But you still always have the agency of what your posture is towards that thing, right?
Yes.
And so that's the part where the sovereignty of God, maybe say, comes into contact with free will is maybe something to do with that. You can't control the stuff that comes at you. And there's even a degree to which you only have so much control over the way that you react to it too, right? Because your habit patterns will oftentimes override, you do the things you don't wish that you did. Right?
Yeah. Well, and this is a point that I make all the time. And I think my mother and my older brother in different ways really taught me this, which is that, in the end, when we get to these things that we think are really big decisions, we've usually already made them. We've made them in the small things that we make over and over and over. And this is why it's so important to be able to be inconvenienced, especially by children, because those are those little decisions over and over of, am I going to choose a little bit harder of a thing? Am I going to, right? So like, and now I would look back at this and call this asceticism, but like I basically, and part of it is I just don't get headaches that often, glory be to God. But like when I do, I generally try to not take ibuprofen or aspirin because I think that's a decision to just say, oh, this is unpleasant. I'm going to step out of the unpleasantness. Now, that being said, what I do tend to do is I do tend to self-medicate with screens because if you haven't noticed, screens are a very powerful analgesic. You stop being aware of the pain in your body when you're looking at a screen because basically the attention you're giving to it means that you don't pay attention to the pain in your body anymore or emotional pain or any of these things. And so streets, I mean, this is what I've seen a couple of academic papers about the fact that VR has a near equivalency in terms of pain relief for morphine for people in hospitals. Okay, so that should tell you something. So
that's like a counter to what we were talking about earlier. It's not necessarily indicative of it being a good thing if paying attention to it takes away your suffering.
That's right.
Right. So just paying attention to something other than your suffering, you're still directing your attention towards something. And that could be something Cory, even worse. Potentially.
There's nothing that's good except goodness. Right. So like you can't make a rule that says this is good. It's like, well, relieving pain is good. I mean, yes, almost always, but not always. It's, it's like, and you can just go on and on and on. And it's like, this is Vervaeke's point at the conference about how we're constantly trying to encode wisdom in rules. And that just like, it just doesn't work. And that's why when you see the wisdom literature in the Holy Scriptures, it's like, you've got Proverbs and you've got Ecclesiastes. You got both of them. Like you have to have both of them because that's how wisdom works. And so you say, it's like, it's good to relieve people of pain. It's like, yes, generally speaking, on the whole, it's better to relieve people of pain. But again, and then there's like the whole thing of disciplining your children. And it's like, I don't want my children to be in pain, but I also understand that there are places where it's like necessary for them to experience pain. Again, because like reality is real.
Higher goods. There's higher goods that override those lower goods, right?
Right, which is why you can actually take the notion of Epicureanism, and Epicureanism is true, right? It's like, well, you want to be happy and you want to experience pleasure. Great. You want to experience the most happiness and the most pleasure. Okay. On what time frame are we talking about? What scale, right? Because that's what Christianity says. Christianity says, die to yourself, right? And then you'll have happiness and pleasure beyond anything that you can comprehend. It's just a question of when are you going to do it and on what terms?
Seek first his kingdom, right? And
then all those things will be added to you.
I think that's what John Piper was trying to get at with the Christian hedonism thing, which often I think that's often misinterpreted, but it's essentially right. Like it's probably not the best frame through which to see everything.
Well,
But
when you're in a hedonistic
not
culture,
wrong.
it's not the best. It's just not the best frame to see things. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, what is
Maybe
the
choose
whole thing-
asceticism. Maybe that would be good if you live in a super ascetic culture.
Yeah,
Balance
exactly.
things out.
Where it's like look up, like God in the end desires happiness for all men. It's like, yes, but in a world in which we're like totally inundated with the things that we are, it's like it's what you're saying, which is, hey, I'm in the airplane with a crying baby. I'm going to embrace this moment. I'm going to take my headphones off and like feel the discomfort of it.
Yeah.
Because that's asceticism. Not taking aspirin every time my head hurts, taking off your headphones when there's a crying baby in an airplane. Those are forms of asceticism. We think of asceticism as self-punishment, but what asceticism is fundamentally is it's spiritual training, right?
Yeah. So, and that's actually interesting too that you put it that way, because that I haven't thought about it in those terms. It's charitable of you, but it's actually kind of, because I didn't leave my headphones off because I wanted my eardrums to be in pain, because I thought that I would gain something from that. I left it off because it made me think of something that was really important, that I was enjoying experiencing. That was a higher, somehow it was a higher good that overrode my desire to protect my eardrums.
That's asceticism. Asceticism is not saying food is bad. If you think that food is bad, you should not fast. Like really, if you think food is bad, you shouldn't fast. You should actually feast if you think food is bad. Yeah. Because look, there's a saying, and I know at least the Dominicans say it, that it's as wrong to feast on a fast day as it is to fast on a feast day. And it's like the point is not food is bad or good, or sex is bad or good, or sleep is bad, or whatever. No, the whole thing is it's exactly what you're saying. It's that you are giving that thing up in order to enjoy something higher. And so you're saying it's not that food is bad. In fact, food is good. And the more that you fast appropriately, the more you will understand how good food is because you're fasting. But so I'm going to throw something out there for you, Cory. Inconvenience is the same thing as asceticism if it's approached appropriately. That's all that it is, and that's what it always is.
So I would say that it's not the same thing, because asceticism has to do with your posture towards inconvenience. Is the way that I. That's what I'm saying. I would say that inconvenience is the necessary component. It's the asceticism is almost the way, because you can't actually avoid inconvenience. And one of the things that I was writing about in that little essay is we live in a culture where we increasingly have the capacity and the desire to curate our experience, right? To protect ourselves so that we don't have to be inconvenienced. And what people actually find when you live that way is that you can't block out the inconvenience. If you make your setting so perfectly comfortable, all that it does is narrow your experience so that the tiniest little change from what you're expecting will throw you off and make you super upset, versus the other way around. If you just kind of embrace stuff as it comes to you, and you change you don't even think about the convenience or the inconvenience of it. You put your attention on whatever the higher thing is.
I mean, there's immediately 1,000 things that makes me think of. I mean, one is Milton's great, like probably the best part of his writing, in my opinion, is when Satan looks over Eden after he's been let out of hell, and he looks at Eden and he's having this monologue where he says, like, you know what? It wouldn't matter if I lived in paradise. I would still be tortured. He says, I bring hell within me. Myself am hell. Right? It's exactly that. It's these things. It's the idea of magic, basically. That if I could just order everything outside of myself, then I wouldn't have to deal with what's inside of me. And like, there's a reason that magic stories end the way that they do. Okay, so that's one thing. Another is that, well, one is C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity when he talks about the woman who doesn't think she's greedy because she doesn't want a lot of food. She just wants it just right. It's like, that's also greed. So then another thing I'm thinking of is when I was in Boy Scouts, we went to Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, and that was the longest backpacking trip I'd been on. I think it was like 13 days or something. And like, you're a growing kid. It just doesn't matter how much you eat when you're walking 10 to 20 miles a day. Like you'll just eat anything that's put in front of you. And so they provide the food for you, which is great, but like it's just like garbage freeze-dried meals, basically. But I remember. But it
tastes really, really good. Cory, I've been to Philmont too.
Yes. So I remember 10 days in, this like freeze-dried beef stroganoff. And like we were at a camp and they had some extra food, so we had double portions of this beef stroganoff. And dude, that was one of the best meals I've had in my entire life. It's like, oh, that's really good. Like that's really good. My friend Brandon, who's a Catholic butcher, calls it the sauce of hunger, the sauce of labor. He's like,
that's right. Oh, that's great. That's like they say. What was it? What's the saying? It's the hunger is the best seasoning or something like that.
Yeah, and I'm sure like in the middle, you know, I don't know how much you've had to do this, but like, I mean, this whole thing is, you know, the whole. I mean, it's a stupid thing, but I remember this Beetle Bailey comic strip growing up where he's at his family's and he's like misses the bus or something, and so he's gonna have to spend the night, and his sister's like, well, I'll make up the guest bed for you. I hope you don't mind that. And he's like, she looks over and he's already like asleep on the couch. It's like there's this degree to which if you are, and here's the thing though about it is that the problem is that like you move no matter what happens, and so when it's what do they call it? They call it the treadmill problem. It's like it's part of like modern psychological research is the treadmill problem, the hedonistic treadmill, which is it doesn't matter how much you correct for circumstances, how much you improve circumstances, people's expectations of them move with that. And so this is why there's something like the degree to which we're grateful for the world around us is a combination of the difference between our expectations and reality, and then the capacity to which we can give. It's something like those two things. So I always used to say there's a difference between expectation and actuality. And then Catherine Wilson brought up, well, what about giving? And I was like, okay, yeah, I need to integrate that into here. But in terms of like how satisfied I am with, well, okay, maybe, but there's something about giving changing your expectations too. So maybe there's something.
No, 100%. Yeah, because giving is something that arises out of a certain heart, right? You can give with a good heart or a false heart. Giving is something that arises as there is need. And so if you have a certain posture towards the inconvenience of having to let go of something that you have to let somebody else have it because of the greater good involved, like it's of the same sort of thing. Giving is also, that's why tithing and giving is in the same category as fasting.
Right. Well, it's
exactly another ascetic practice.
The three ascetic practices are fundamentally fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. Which is interesting that prayer is an ascetic practice, right? So it's like, should my spirituality bubble up spontaneously from my being? It's like, that'd be great, but it's not gonna. Yeah. It's just not gonna. And so like,
it might, but you have to get there first. You can't just, this was the thing that I struggled with as a Protestant too, because I think a lot of Protestants will teach that's, that is kind of where you want to be. It's like, okay, great.
How do you get there?
He's like, yeah, I spent time praying, like, God, make me want to read the scriptures. Why is this so hard for me? Am I doing it wrong?
Yeah.
And like, but then you learn
So is this an inconvenience, right? Isn't it an inconvenience to have to pray this long? You could see it as an inconvenience, right? I mean, obviously, right? I haven't made any vows. I'm not under an obligation to pray a rosary daily, right? So that's not an obligation, but like, there's plenty of times where I'm like, I'd rather not, right? It's inconvenient for me to continue with this habit in that sense. But then like what happens? It's like, well, for one thing, I pray way more than I used to.
Yeah, you do way more than you used to. And you also see the reality of what happens when you turn it into a lifestyle, you turn it into a habit. And that becomes very evident when you miss a day, right? And how does the rest of your day feel? When you didn't do your prayer time that morning? That's a thing that, man, I don't know why it took me so long.
So I want to, because we were talking about changing diapers and we're talking about asceticism and we're talking about what asceticism is oriented towards. So I wish I could remember where this first got into my head. It's good enough that it had to have come from someone else. So I'm just going to assume that I got this from someone, and I don't know where that came from, but God bless them.
Take credit. That's okay.
No, I don't want to, because at any rate, but I do. It came up in a conversation when a friend was asking me who hadn't had any children yet, like, basically, what's your advice for having, for becoming a parent, for becoming a father? And I think this is when it clicked for me, which is that in the end, the best thing that you can do as a parent is to delight in your children. Because at the end of the day, that's what your child wants more than anything else, is for you to delight in them. for them to be delightful. And the wonderful thing is that when your child is delightful to you, then like all of those inconveniences are taken up into the fact that your child is delightful. And so you can see the way that this actually changes all of it, because you say, I'm going to go change my son's diaper and he's old enough that he's like an absolute squirm fest, right? Or putting his diaper on after, we've cleaned him up at bedtime. And it's like, I can approach that as this is an inconvenience. And then it's just a pain. And he's a monkey and he's going everywhere. And like, I'm fighting him and holding him down with 1.5 arms. So I'm trying to get the tab of the diaper on and, wishing that I'd learned jujitsu because it would make it easier. Or I can think like, my son is delightful and this is delight. And then it turns into this like awesome playtime, right? And he's laughing and I'm having a fun time. And there's this wonderful, because that's how asceticism can be too, and how it should be. I think we can say, oh, it's this drudgery. And like, sometimes it's hard and it just is. And like, that's great. Actually, it's just great that it's hard, because that's where you develop the increased capacity to take delight in what's going on in the world around you, is when it's hard and you choose to do it anyway. And like, it also, if I just didn't know how to change a diaper, I wouldn't be able to delight in changing my son's diaper. And like, do not let me hold myself up beyond what I am at all. Like, there's plenty of times where I'm just like, wow, I'm so grateful for how many diapers my wife changes. Or I'm not even that good. And I'm just like, I just don't want to change this diaper, right? It's like, sometimes it's not even the gratitude thing. But I get the vision of it. I get the vision of there's this joy in saying, look, when I know I bring this up a lot, but like when we got the diagnosis for a second child's congenital anatomical issues, it was one of the first times in my life where it's like, I didn't see how this is all going to fit together. Right? Because like I was saying earlier, like I can tell the story of my life in a lot of ways, right? And there's a way that I'm a pretty good storyteller, so I can make it sound like it all fits together.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, we're not going to have a family where everyone's just perfectly healthy and we're all just happy, healthy people. It's like, it's just not happening. That's over. What's weird is that was actually a huge relief in the end, because now we're like, all right, look, I don't know if you listened to the first conversation I had with Karen Wong, but she brought up stone walls and how there's this process of like integrating the stones into the wall. And then I ended up comparing that between a brick wall and a stone wall, and this process of creation versus redemption. And with a stone wall, you're building the stone wall. You're creating it because everything is ordered exactly towards the stone wall. And you can see how it's ordered towards building the wall. They're all rectangular and 90 degrees and it's great. And everything's you just follow the pattern, the algorithm of laying the bricks on up, and then it looks like a brick wall. Whereas like a dry set stone wall with undressed stone, you are, okay, what's the shape I need next? And, how do I fit these things together, and on and on and on. And what happened, that was the deepest level that it happened with our daughter, was I stopped seeing my life as the brick wall and I started seeing it as the stone wall. And I realized it's not about making it all work. It's about salvaging the good out of it that I can. And what's weird is, Cory, when you view your life that way, it's actually so much better. So like when you insist on, I'm going to build the good wall, I'm going to build the good brick wall, most people who are like that are miserable. They're like driven or miserable. And then when something breaks that, when there's that merciful break, when let's say it's an inconvenience that's so big you can't get around it anymore.
Yeah.
That'd be one way of saying it. It's the anomaly. It's Job. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, I can't make it perfect. Like, so we're going to make it as good as we can. We're going to just try to make it as good as we can. And the freedom.
And guess what? So that brings in you're going to say freedom. I was going to say the real freedom, which consists of constraint, right?
Yes.
So when you're constrained, that is when the creation that arises is actually beautiful, instead of this monotonous, all-encompassing thing that you think is freedom, but it ends up just being the narrowness of your experience, which precludes you from experiencing the beautiful even. Yeah.
That, man. So like pray to God that he grants us the mercy that we can see that in all of these things. And
Yeah. Amen. Man, how often I never do that. That's the thing too, right? It's the kind of the beauty of this is that those things, at least in my experience, I've kind of, like, it's just grace though. I've kind of learned to be able to choose inconvenience a little bit. I've started to learn a little bit of asceticism, but again, how long it's taken me and how many times I say that on a daily basis, I choose convenience on a daily basis, multiple times. And it really even took God breaking my brick wall completely down and shattering it for me to be able to recognize how silly what I was doing was. And like that, I don't have the capacity, in a sense, of choosing that for myself. I really don't. It's something that he did to me. And yes, I had a certain posture towards it, but so much greater and more encompassing was the grace of inconvenience that he put on me.
So I've got two things on that, and then I think you should just, if there's anything else you want to say, we should do that, and then we'll wrap up. There's two things I think of. One is there's a poet, Khalil Gibran, who I haven't read in years, but he's got a book called a collection of poems called The Madman, and in one of them he talks about it's very strange man, very strange poems, but he talks about how comfort has got its meat hooks in us.
Putting it.
Man, that one has stuck with me for like 10 years now, at least. That's what I read that poem. It's like,
what was his name again?
Khalil Gibran.
I have no idea how to spell that.
If you look up The Madman, you'll find it. Okay. He's an interesting fellow. He's a sort of Christian adjacent mystic.
It's funny how much that is a category that I'm familiar with now.
Yeah, exactly.
That's actually perfect because I wanted to ask you before we finished.
Oh, yeah.
Poetry, man. That is one aspect of my education that I completely missed out on. Even I had the desire to read poetry, but I never had really the impetus to do it. And now I feel like I've missed out on a whole area of life. So what advice would you give to somebody listening who has like no poetry knowledge or experience? Where would you start? And how do you read poetry? Do you read a little bit every day, or do you read it in groups? Do you read it by yourself?
I would start by coming to the November 17th and 18th This Little Corner get together in Arkansas.
We could have planned this plug.
I know. I saw this one coming. I saw it coming when I was like, Cory's giving me the best lead up to this I can possibly imagine. So yeah, here in a day or two, we'll go live with the registration for it, and I'll put it up on my channel and probably put it in the description of this conversation. Okay, so we're gonna be because that's what we're gonna be talking about. We've got a few speakers, and the notion is basically how does poetry inform our perception, and how does it enrich our perception, and how does it mirror our perception? So my basic thing about how to read poetry is to just read it. I know that sounds obnoxious, but I would just say, just read it. Just read. I mean, I have people I could recommend to you, like, don't do what I did, which is say, I'm going to start reading poetry and then decide to read Paradise Lost, because you're not an undergraduate in summer school. And so it'll just, you just probably won't finish. Maybe you will. Maybe I'm giving you bad advice, but I could throw some poets your way. But this is what I would say, Cory. Don't analyze it. Just read it and enjoy it. Just read it and enjoy it. Because there is, and I might step on toes with this, but there's a category of people who like love poetry who I can't talk to.
I can see it.
There's another category of people though where it's just like they just love poetry, and that's how I would describe the difference. There's the people who love poetry, and there's the people who just love poetry. And the second one, I'm like, we can have really good conversations. And so I would say, don't try to make it anything more than it is. Just get what you can get from it. And like, if it's something that you connect with and it speaks to you, you don't have to worry about it. Like, you don't have to worry about, I mean, memorizing it's a lot of fun. Like, I've got a couple of Gerard Manley Hopkins poems memorized, and I love those. I wish I had more poetry memorized. And I don't make a practice of it. I've read, the Divine I mean, the weird thing about poetry is it's like such a huge thing. And you have, so like on the one hand, you have short lyrical poems, or Shakespeare's sonnets, or, Richard Wilbur's poems, or you have, Ogden Nash's silly poems. The problem with a kitten is that it eventually becomes a cat. It's like, that's poetry. That's a poem that I have memorized. But then you also have like the Divine Comedy and the Odyssey by Homer. And it's like, so I would say that poetry in general like, don't be worried about being led by delight, and don't look at it and think, I didn't get it. Like, if it calls out to you in any way, if it witnesses to anything, then that's enough.
Because it doesn't have to connect propositionally, right? It's not intended to some degree.
Generally not. There's, and again, like,
I mean, it can obviously, but that's poetry, not from your conversation with Nate. It sounded like it was supposed to connect at a level that you don't necessarily understand.
That is right. There's a particular like poetic thing where it's not something that you exactly understand, or Mark Lefebvre put it in an interesting way, where it's like a multiple to multiple correspondence. And so instead of a one-to-one correspondence, it's like a multiple to multiple. So that'd be another sort of like basic way that poetry operates. Also, like Owen Barfield, he says, poetic diction is the reason that prophets old is completely different from the phrase old prophets.
I'll have to think about that.
Yeah. So if you want like some of my favorites, Richard Wilbur is a recent American poet that I really love. Love calls us to the things of this world. Lying, those are both great poems. Some older stuff like John Donne and Herbert, those are the metaphysical poets. They're interesting. Some of the metaphysical poets, they're really interesting. I really love Dover Beach. I can't remember who it's by. If you want a poem that will that one breaks my heart. Everything that Hopkins has written, I love. Father Gerard Manley Hopkins. And if you want a poem that just like sets off fireworks in your head, he's the one in particular where you should just read it out loud, and then you should just keep on reading it out loud over and over and over. Mm. And what's really fun, because look, and this is actually personally what I'm going to be talking about at the conference in November, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But like, what he's trying to do with his poetry is the analog to the way that he understands that we perceive things, which actually matches really, really well with the stuff that Peterson, Vervaeke, and Pajot are articulating in terms of how human perception works, and Owen Barfield as well. So like, what he's trying to do when you read your poetry is you get to go through a thing that you're no longer, you're basically unconscious of, because you're not a 2-year-old or someone who's, spent their whole life dwelling on human perception, trying to be really conscious of it. So he's like trying to give you the chance to do that again, which is really cool. So there's a lot, you can go really, really way down into that. And I'm planning on having a conversation with this professor at University of Dallas who wrote a book on Hopkins that I really love, that I've been reading on and off for like 6 years now. And it's the best scholarship that I've seen on Hopkins' sort of philosophy of perception. Anyway, but all that to say, I don't want to make it too complicated. Like, just find stuff that you enjoy. There's this great poem that I can't remember what it's called. Jubilato something that Dr. Jack at the conference sent me. And it's just like, it's part of a larger poem, and it's like a 200-line panegyric about his cat. It's just like the poet, and he's like 18th century English, 18th or 19th century Englishman, and he's just like talking about how great his cat is. And it's like, there's this sense in which when we make poetry too much, then we like can't get at it. Because like we're trying to make it God or something, or we're trying to make it really more important than it is, and
trying to make it the main thing, right, instead of that which it points to.
Exactly right. it's poetry is something like an affordance, right? It's a particular mode of perception, and amongst other things. And when you see it as that, then it's a tremendous blessing. And like most of a big chunk of scripture, or in Nate's view, maybe all of scripture should be viewed poetically, right? So it's not something on the periphery, I would say, at all. It's something very near the center. But because it's near the center, look, just because you, let's say, don't totally understand being a father doesn't mean that you stop being a father, or that you can't be a father, or any of these things, or being a husband, being a man, cooking a meal, right? G.K. Chesterton talks about how it's the things that are closest to us that we actually understand the least of. Like in terms of you can say more definitively probably about a black hole than you can say about death, or about the life of, say, a manta ray than you can about what it means to be a child. And so poetry is like that, where you don't have to understand it to operate in it. What you have to do is you just have to operate in it. And the virtues in poetry are the same as the virtues in life. They translate differently. But again, like humility is the first, should be your first. It's like that's the gateway to all the things. Humility is the gateway to everything. And so to be a pompous whatever over poetry is like the surest way to not understand poetry. But if you can approach it humbly, with open hands, right? We were talking last time about what's this fundamental orientation towards the world, and if we're taking Christ as our example, it's let's say having radically open hands, right? Because you can't close them. Look, I mean, there's this, our Lord arguably spoken poetry, with his parables, and this, and on and on and on and on. And it's like, just go there and don't, especially initially, like, unless you're, say, like a literary professor, like, don't be technical about it. Probably technique is the worst thing you could do. You could bring either pride or technique. If you can avoid pride and technique, it'd be something like that. Then you can read poetry.
Sure. Well, it really makes it sound a lot like what you're saying. Tell me if this is overstating the case. Poetry is kind of a way to just learn how to exist in reality. So like if Nate says that all of the Bible is appropriately read in poetry, yeah. I would say that, wrap it around to what we were talking about before. If you learn how to see your entire life as a narrative, if you learn how to see your entire life poetically, that probably teaches you something about the proper way to live.
Well, look, that's great. I love that. Okay, because this whole notion of just, right, the whole flat ontology, that's the just, that's, it's just whatever. It's just chemicals. It's just rocks. It's just biology, right? Poetry is the antidote to that. So if you can't get out of the just, you'll never read poetry. And if you can read poetry, you'll get out of the just.
Beautiful.
That's how I'd put it. Also T.S. Eliot. So I love the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. Like that's another great one. Choruses by The Rock. I mean, a lot of his stuff is good, but Choruses from The Rock and the Four Quartets by Eliot, those are also really lovely. So yeah, I mean, I'm just do it, and read a little bit of it and see what sticks with you and see what you come back to. And like if you love it,
I'm definitely planning to go to the conference that you guys have planned. Are there going to be, I don't know how much of it is already like structured and planned, but I'm assuming there's going to be a little bit of live performance of poetry, like recitation, dramatic recitation.
Yep, there will be.
Because that sounds cool. There is not enough of that.
Anyone who's interested, this will be on the registration as well. Just email me what you want to read, either of your own composition or someone else's, and like we're gonna have 2 or 3 sessions for people to just come up and recite or read.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's
so
cool.
Well, Cory, I'm gonna wrap up. This is an absolute delight, man. Thanks so much. I'm sure we'll
Thanks
talk
for having me on again, Ted.
Yeah,
definitely.
God bless you and your family.
Yeah, you too.